Great tragedies. So this is the paper I'm referring to, and it's both an interview and a bit of discussion of how David's views developed over time.
Right.
And I learned a few things about David that I didn't know beforehand. For example, I thought he was always oh yes, yes, that's so he's a rabid anarchist. But in fact, he had experience. He explains early in this paper where he was experiencing anarchists in the 80s, and it was pretty disastrous. And funnily enough, that parallels my personal experience. So I'll go to give a bit of a presentation here and go through how my work has been influenced by David and vice versa. So can you see my screen? Okay. Well, I couldn't resist using a pun on my name
And I
and
love it.
David's.
That's what's up. And
Okay. Uh, so I'm keen on Graeber, always was. And let's just get this. I'm trying to get this bloody meeting controls to get out of my way there. Okay. So, keen on Graeber. And this is a lovely little photograph, one of the several times I had dinner with Nika and David back in their house in was it Chelsea? I keep forgetting. Um, but I thought that friendship would go on forever. That was taken in September of 2019. And of course, less than a year later, he was gone. So a great tragedy. I really thought I'd be working with him and interacting with him indefinitely. So one of those great tragedies. As you say in your profile, what was forever is no more. So there's no permanency in life, unfortunately. And looking through this paper, it has quite a bit of background about David's own life and how he got to be who he is. And one thing I found quite funny was him talking about his family, because he said when you're growing up, your parents are the opposite of cool. You can't imagine your parents being cool. And unlike him, I didn't have to imagine because my parents were not cool. That's my father on the left-hand side there. That's one of I think my graduation for my arts degree. You know, I'm sneaking in a black power salute in the middle of the my graduation photo just to annoy my father. But as David says that his father, uh, he suddenly realised when his dad was talking about going to a hockey game and said the last hockey game he went to was with a beat poet, and he suddenly realised, my God, my parents were cool, which was one hell of a shock. Well, mine weren't, and I think that sort of affected my vision of who I could be until I, by accident, ended up being a rebel economist. So that's uh, intriguing how different our backgrounds there and how compatible we found our work when we finally met together. So I started off as a conservative. I swallowed all the neoclassical economics arguments about perfect competition being the best possible system and it being a good idea to abolish trade unions because they're anti-competitive, et cetera, et cetera. All the stuff that gets taught as a part of what you think is a scientific economics degree, but in fact it's a set of ideologies that you're not even aware of until you start being dominated by them. So it was a shock to me to find that what I thought was scientific economics was actually full of enormous holes. And the first hole I learned of was a thing called the theory of the second best. Sounds a bit complicated. It is. But what they showed was if you were two steps from what economists define as nirvana, and you move one step towards it, you would make social welfare worse. Okay. And I was shocked because the arguments you learn from economic theory tells you it's a great idea to abolish trade unions because they distort the labour market. But then if you take in the realistic situation that there are both trade unions and employer collectives, and if you abolish one or the other, according to conventional economic theory, you reduce social welfare. And I thought, this is crazy. What looked like it was a cast iron argument that getting rid of unions would make things better, you suddenly find you admit an element of the real world that there are both collectives for workers and collective for capitalists. Abolishing one or the other makes things worse. This is not a realistic theory. So I very rapidly switched from being a market libertarian, which was quite a common thing for young men in particular, when they first get exposed to economic theory. They swallow all the arguments about efficiency and optimize this and equilibrium that and so on. And rather than becoming a Marxist, I became a political anarchist. So my initial political orientation after I broke away from conventional economic thinking was anarchist. And that applied up to and including when you see this photograph here. That's me at the age of, I think, 21 there. I led a student revolt at Sydney University when I was 20, and this is to show you the history. This is a little poster that you used to carve your posters on I've forgotten the name of this type of printing. This is like silk screen printing to make your posters and leaflets. Long way before computers, let alone the technology we use these days with the internet. So I led a student revolt over the teaching of economics at Sydney University in 1973, and ended up doing a whole lot of things that I didn't expect I'd do as a I had no intention of being a radical, but that's what I turned into. And you get some of this stuff in David's work as well, because I adopted anarchist philosophy as a way of thinking about the world and how we should organize our societies. And I read Bakunin and Kropotkin long before I read Marx, and I was quite sympathetic to the philosophy. And then I organized a conference on anarchist conference, and everything that David talks about here, which I didn't realize he had this experience himself, was literally what I experienced in Australia. Anarchy to me was a way of controlling power, reducing the extent to which powerful people dominate how decisions are made in a society. And of course, to do that, you have to control powerful people. This anarchist conference that I went to in 1973, so a decade before David spoke about this problem, we spent the entire 3 days arguing whether there should or should not be a chairperson for discussions. And I thought, this is ridiculous. So I no longer got involved with that world. But what I realized was, one of the reasons that neoclassical economics appeals to people who believe in it, it's a vision of a perfect anarchist society. You have no government. Anarchy means no government. So the government actually makes things worse in the standard neoclassical theory of a capitalist economy. Everybody gets paid what they're worth. It's a meritocracy. You get paid your marginal products. That means you get paid your contribution to output, and it reaches equilibrium. And equilibrium sounds like a really cool place to be. Nothing ever changes. What they call Pareto optimal, where you can't make anybody else better off without making somebody worse off. It's all about a system, an anarchist system. And one reason that neoclassical economists are so rabid is fundamentally they believe in an anarchist system, which is perfect, and they're trying to impose that on the real world. Now, in fact, it's full of myths. It doesn't work anything like their model itself doesn't work like they think it does, let alone the real world itself. But that is a major reason why they have the appeal, the strength. You're actually fighting another bunch of anarchists, but very powerful anarchists, as it happens. So I ended up doing a bit of fighting of power myself. That's one of the many demonstrations we had at Sydney University. I'm not in the photograph because I'm behind that poster. I know I'm behind that poster because the person to my left in that photograph was my then girlfriend. So that's where I am in that particular demo. So lots of demonstrations, lots of political activity. But ultimately I became an academic. And as David says in this paper, he found the work of Michael Hudson extremely useful from a different perspective. And Michael and I met, I think, in about 2002 or thereabouts, and equally became very close friends long before I knew about David. And I find Michael's work combined anthropology and ancient history with economics, and that worked out very well with my modern dynamic approach to economics at the same time. Modern monetary theory, this is David speaking in this paper back from 2014. That's also become part of my bailiwick, and post-Keynesian is my economic theory area. So all these things were commonalities in David's background and my background that came together when we ended up being in London. And one of the pleasures of becoming a well-known critic of mainstream thought is that I got to meet other well-known critics of mainstream thought who are my heroes. And David was one of them. And to find him being not just a hero, but a personal friend and a close friend in London was absolutely delightful. So it's one of the positives of being an iconoclast and a rebel. You get to meet other great people. And what David said he was trying to do was combine a school of Marxism with post-Keynesian and anthropological traditions. And in a way, I've been doing a similar thing from a different perspective my first academic work was on Marx and the labour theory of value. And I showed that the labour theory of value was contradicted by Marx's dialectical philosophy. So in fact, the whole labour theory of value, the whole Soviet period, all these things were based on fallacies in Marx's own logic. If he'd actually applied his dialectics properly, he would certainly not have been a fan of the Bolshevik approach to bringing about socialism. So that was my first, and I've been trying ever since to combine Marx and post-Keynesian work, and indeed anthropology. So, but my initial contributions again focused on debt. So David is focusing upon debt as a fundamental aspect of human societies and its history over time. I was focusing upon the mathematics of how debt interacts in a capitalist economy. So my first major contribution on that was a paper I wrote back in 1992. It wasn't published until 95, entirely due to publication delays. But that was modeling the role of private debt in a capitalist economy, according to the work of Hyman Minsky. And what came out of that model was quite a remarkable behavior by the system, that you would have a period of cyclical behavior where the cycles would diminish. And if you're in this region here, you think everything is going to reach stability, and suddenly it explodes into chaos and then breakdown. So I saw debt, analysing how debt worked in a capitalist economy, to be absolutely essential to understanding how the economy functions. And yet you wouldn't find this stuff in neoclassical economics at all. They don't include debt, they don't include banks, they don't include money. So what's going on that they actually leave all those critical elements of capitalism out of their thinking? And it comes down to the fact that the neoclassical theory of capitalism fundamentally describes capitalism as a non-monetary system. They see capitalism as being a system of barter, where you swap your pigs for somebody else's flowers, you work out a relative price, money is irrelevant, money is what they call a veil over barter. And I thought it was absolute nonsense all the way through. But the question is, how do you build a model of the economy in which debt plays a central role, and when you can't model it without banks or debt or money? And that was something I wasn't aware of. I couldn't work out how to do at the time. But reading not so much David's work, but the work of a Italian non-orthodox economist called Augusto Graziani, I finally worked out that the essence of understanding how the role of debt in a capitalist economy involved using double entry bookkeeping. Now, this sounds extremely boring. Double entry bookkeeping means accounting. Accountings are boring. The only joke that makes accountants seem funny is the one that says, what is an economist? And the answer is, that's somebody without the intelligence, savoir-faire, and humor to be an accountant. And that's fairly true. They're a boring lot and they're deadly. But they leave banks and debt and money out of their logic. Now, what I did, and this is before I met David, was build a software package that enabled you to include the role of debt in a capitalist economy. So this is a model of the cyclical economy model. It comes out of Marx's chapter 25, volume 1 of Capital, where he's talking about cycles in the economy caused by cycles in the distribution of income. And what you get out of this is a cyclical economy, but it doesn't undergo a breakdown. When you include debt, what you get is the possibility for cycles to lead to a period of rising private debt, which is happening over here. The rising private debt causes a falling amount of money going to workers. So the bankers get rich at the expense of workers, even though in this model, workers are not doing any borrowing. It's capitalists who are doing the borrowing. And you finally end up with a social collapse, which is what, now don't worry about it. Don't worry about not understanding in this slide. I'm going to get to a final point where I want to show stuff I would like you to understand, because a huge part of our social problems these days come out of economic theory that panics about the level of government debt and doesn't talk one iota about the level of private debt. But what David did by focusing on debt in the debt as a part of a private system, obviously evolving out of the state, but fundamentally private debt being the issue, was it showed how critical debt is to the functioning of a capitalist economy and how it can damage it. Now, so David's talked about debt in yet the first 5,000 years. He talks, this article was written after the book, of course. And debt plays a critical role in all sorts of human societies, right from early Sumerian time to today. But it doesn't turn up in economic theory at all. And what I'm quoting here is the argument from Ben Bernanke, ex-Federal Reserve chairman, the guy who was chairman of the Federal Reserve when the global financial crisis hit. And he wrote a book called Essays on the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, if you're a non-orthodox thinker, you immediately associate that with the private debt bubble, and Bernanke doesn't mention debt at all. And the reason he gives here is that what he called debt deflation, he says, is no more than a redistribution from debtors to creditors. So debtors pay creditors back, and that just changes who's got the money. It doesn't destroy any money. And he got a Nobel Prize for this sort of work. This is economists just completely ignoring the level of private debt. Now, if you look at what happened in the post-war period, after the Great Depression, after the Second World War, what happened in America, and this is a global trend, was a rising level of private debt to GDP. And because of this guy, not only because of him, because of economic theory in general, that we ignored this. Everybody obsesses about the level of government debt, and you can see government debt starting at higher than private debt as a percentage of GDP after World War II, but then falling all the way through the post-war period until Reagan. Rising level of private debt they completely ignored because, in their opinion, private debt is basically an act between consenting adults. The state shouldn't be involved. It has no effects on anybody else, and that's all complete bullshit. Because when you take a look at the relationship between change in private debt and the level of economic activity, the red line here is the unemployment rate. The black line is the rate of change of private debt as a percentage of GDP, and they're virtually mirror opposites. When credit goes up, unemployment goes down. When credit goes down, unemployment goes up, and credit turning negative causes a depression. So this is the critical importance of debt in a capitalist economy, completely ignored by people like Bernanke. I prefer to call him Ben Bernanke, who should have been in charge, should have stopped us accumulating this level of private debt. If they actually understood how a capitalist economy functions, they would have seen this rising level of private debt as a threat to economic stability. Instead, what they did was argue that you can ignore private debt, doesn't matter macroeconomically, and they therefore ignore one of the major determining features of a capitalist economy. So the ironic thing is, an anthropologist with no background in economics understood the economy better than the economists. Why is it that they ignore the level of private debt? And it comes down to if they include private debt and how banks create money properly, then they end up having money and debt having a significant impact upon the economy when they try to argue it's a barter system. So if they bring in any elements of reality that private debt actually adds to aggregate demand, private credit increases demand, as you can see from this relationship here, rising credit, falling unemployment, falling credit, rising unemployment, that volatility, that causal impact upon economic activity by the level of credit means you've got to look at banks, you've got to look at debt, you've got to look at money in your macroeconomic models. But neoclassicals leave that out completely. And yet they give us advice on what to do with government debt. So it's tragic that we have people in charge, economists of the economic policy, who have no idea of how the economy operates, and an anthropologist, in David's case, far better understanding the importance of private debt, the importance of debt relations in a capitalist economy, the importance of money. So we have a complex system being driven by fools. And the main danger we face right now is this fool. And I trust him on rockets, I trust him on electric cars, I do not trust him on the economy. Actually, one thing I just realized I better do before I try to run this clip is that I've got to set up the sound so that it plays the computer stereo. So here is what Americans face, or anybody living in America now faces, from the belief that economists have that the level of government debt is the main worry we face. Let's go back to the slideshow running again. Pardon me.
He's going bankrupt. Like if we don't take action, we're dollar's gonna be worth nothing, and interest payments, which are already 23% of 23% of all government income, income taxes, tariffs, and everything, is just going to pay interest right now. And that number is continually rising. So if we don't do something, the entire government budget will be paying interest. There won't be money for anything. No, there won't be money for Social Security. There won't be money for Medicare, nothing. That's where we're headed. That's what bankruptcy means.
Yeah, that's such an insane concept.
Yes. It's like, hello, wake up, wake up. And if somebody can tell me, can show me, like, pencil out the math and show me how this works, I'd love to hear it. But I'm just like, listen, I'm looking at the numbers here, and I'm like, if we don't do something, America's toast. There won't be money for anything.
So that's the mentality we face. And that mentality, we might like to leave down to a nutcase engineer, but in fact, you can read that in any economics textbook. So this is Gregory Mankiw's macroeconomics book, which is introductory teaching in most universities around the world these days. And the belief that government spending is bad, government debt is bad, and ignoring the role of private debt comes straight out of these books. So here's Mankiw talking about what banks do. And they say banks are intermediaries here. Banks enables savers to lend money to borrowers. So households save, and then banks lend the money that households have saved to investors. And if the government gets involved, so the investors borrow from the public, and that enables economic activity to occur. So that's good. We don't really worry about the level of, that's a private decision between households and firms. But if the government spends more money, and it does that by running a deficit, then that increases interest rates and reduces investment, and government purchases crowd out investment. So you get a crisis coming out of the government doing any spending. And that's the mentality that lies behind the argument that you see from Musk there, that we're going to have a crisis if we let government debt continue rising. Now, I know this is I'm being a bit chaotic in how I'm giving this presentation. I normally write quite a detailed presentation, but I thought I'd be a bit more informal here. But what I want to do, if that's okay by everybody, I want to show the mind model that economists have about how banking operates, and why that mind model, if it was the real world, it would mean that they're right. We have to reduce government spending, so we've got to slash welfare, slash health spending. We can still send bombs to Ukraine and Israel, but we've got to cut welfare and cut social security and cut education. That would actually be correct if their model with banking was correct. So what I've done over the last decade since meeting up with David is I've built software that lets me model this. So could you handle me trying to build a model for you to show what people actually think happens with banking? Feasible? Okay, so it's going to be a bit mathematical, but let's see if you can follow me through the whole operation. So this is my software package called Ravel, and I'm just going to load the program. That's just a screenshot of it. I'm loading the program now. And particularly people in England and America right now, you've got governments that are determined to reduce the level of government spending. And let's see, I'll try that. Let's see if I can load this one. Okay, it's too late. I've already finished that one, so I'll start from a blank system. And their idea of what banks actually do is being intermediaries. So banks enable households lend to firms. So you need to have I'll just bring up the table here. And let's bring it up here, hang on. So their vision of what banks do involves double entry bookkeeping, which is something which David became very familiar with. So their idea is that banks have firms who deposit money with banks, households who deposit money with banks, and government which deposit money with banks. And the banks themselves have their own little hand in the till here. Their money is in what's called short-term equity. And the model they have is that we all have bank accounts. Let's say there's $90 billion in firms accounts and $90 billion in households and $90 billion in the government account. and the banks have got 30 billion, that sort of level of numbers. And you have firms produce output and they sell to consumers. So what that involves is money comes out of household accounts and go into firms' accounts. And of course, to produce output, firms have to hire workers. So that means they pay wages. So wages dollars per year comes out of firms' accounts and goes into households, which enables them to consume. And then firms also borrow from households. So there's going to be borrowed dollars per year coming out of household accounts and going to firms. And then firms have to pay interest on that. So that is going to be money coming out of the household account, of the firm's accounts. I'll call this INT for interest. I'll give it the full word, interest. And that is income to the households. That's why they lend the money. And then you have the government getting in. So the government, so the banks only make money by charging a fee. So the households pay a fee to the banks for introducing to somebody who wants to borrow money from them. And then the banks spend. So that's going to be money coming out of the bank account, spending by banks. And they spend on firms. And then you have the government getting involved. So there's taxation. So taxation, the government takes money out of household accounts. So there's tax payments coming out of households and going to the government. And then the government spends. And I'm going to have them spending, just for simplicity, spending only on firms. So that's spending by the government. And that goes into firms' accounts. I'll just spend underscore G to simplify things there. And then the government is required to sell bonds if its spending exceeds its taxation. So that's going to be, they get revenue from bond sales turning up in the government account. Pardon me. Let's type curly brackets there. Uh-oh, have I stuffed myself up here? Let's see. I think I better delete that line and start over again. So I'll have the bond sales by the government. It's required to sell bonds equivalent to its deficit plus interest payments. So that's going to be I just call bonds as revenue for the government, and that comes out of households. So they sell the bonds to the households. So the government households transfer money from their account to the government, and then you've got to pay interest on outstanding bonds. These are all requirements of government rules. So that's minus interest on bonds coming out of the government account and going to the household's account. So that's the vision that they have of how the banking system operates. And I'll just put that into what's called editor mode so you can see those tables more clearly on screen. That's their vision of how the banking system operates. And I just need to now show the same thing from the point of view of each of the sectors in the economy. So the firms, what does the banking system look like from their point of view? So what I can do with Ravel is show the financial system from everybody's point of view. So firms have a bank account, and all the operations I've shown there for the firms now comes across to this table, and there's also debt of firms, which hasn't turned up on the model yet because the debt of the firms is a liability of the firms, but it's actually an asset of the household sector. So they borrow from the household sector, and then all the other operations there increase the net worth of firms. So I'm just going to show, just balance that very quickly. So what I'm building here, and I know this looks a bit strange if you expected a philosophical discussion and suddenly I'm showing tables everywhere in accounting. What I'm trying to show is how the conventional people think about banking and why they're terrified about government debt. And I've realized the only way we can fight this is for the public to realize they're terrified because they've got the wrong model. And when you change from the wrong model to the right one, everything you're scared about disappears. Now, at the moment, if you have friends who are conservative in any political sense, they are going to be worried about government spending. And what about all the debt? Isn't that a problem? Hasn't Musk got a point? He does have a point if the textbooks are right. David's point is the textbooks are wrong. And I want to show that using this mathematical approach rather than just verbally showing it, show that in fact if you do what the Reeves and Musk and Trump and the European Union all want to do to reduce government debt, they're going to cause a depression. Okay? Rather than making the economy operate better, they're making it operate worse. So I've now got the firms inside there. I now need to add the households. And bring up their table. And they've got a bank account, which I can show here. That's all the bank, the transfers that the bank shown at their level. But they've also got another asset. They own the debt of firms because firms are borrowing from them. And there's also the debt of the government sector, which I'll just put the debt of government here. So the sale of bonds is increasing the value of the debt that the government owes to the banking sector in this model. And then I can just have the household's equity here, their net worth. And now let's just balance everything so I can bring all the lows across to show what's increasing the net worth of households. Then I need to bring in the central bank because I've got the Fed in there because the reserves are an asset of the Fed. So I'll just call this the Fed for Americans. They'll know what I'm talking about. And then bring up its table. And then nothing much happens with the Fed in this model because all they've got is they've got reserves as an asset, but nothing is happening on the reserves column over here. Bring up their table. So they've got a liability of reserves. They've got the Fed equity here, Fed net worth. And I can now just balance that. So that's got the Fed covered. And then we have to have the government inside there because the Treasury is the element of the government that handles taxing and spending and all that sort of jazz. So now we have the Treasury here. And let's put that in editor mode and then bring up the Treasury's account here. So show their transactions. And they've got an asset of the government bank account. So we bring that across. They've got liability, the debt of the government, that bring that across. This is the net worth of the Treasury. Balance that column across there. So that's how the conventional textbooks, even though they don't know it because they don't do double entry bookkeeping, this is how they think the financial system operates. Now that's just showing the accounting. I know I'm pushing the friendship here, so I apologize for being very technical, but I'm trying to write a book on this front to show people how to use this software to point out what's wrong with what the American government, UK government, are doing. They think they're managing capitalism better. They're actually going to make it work worse, much, much worse than it actually does. And Simon's saying a paper explains lendable funds model does not exist. That's true. The Bank of England came out in 2014 and said this model is false. Banks are not intermediaries, banks actually lend. And the Bundesbank did the same thing. So I want to show the consequences of this model and then convert it across to the real world and show those dilemmas disappear. And we're not going to get this taught by universities. We're not going to get it taught by economics departments in particular. If we're going to undermine this dominance by neoliberals and destruction of capitalism as a result of it, it's got to come from the people instead. So I'm going to rapidly, and I know I'm doing this, I feel a bit embarrassed. I know I'm doing this far too quickly. But what I want to show is how you can put a model together and then show that the real world does not have the problems that the fictional world that economists live inside actually assumes. So I'm going to have firms, GDP being generated by firms turning over the money in their bank accounts. So if I'd have, say, the GDP is fundamentally going to be money turning over in the bank accounts of the firm sector, paying goods and services, buying from other firms and so on, and that generates GDP. It's very, very. I'm sorry to be racing so much. I do realise that I'm doing a bad demo here if you're not expecting to be getting a mathematical model. But I think you'll see the value of it when I finish putting the whole thing together. So first off, I've got GDP coming out of this. So GDP starts off at, there's got to be money in the firm sector. I put 90 inside there, GDP of 180. Then I've got wages being GDP times a wages share. So let's say workers get 60% of GDP, which is roughly correct. So give it a value of 0.6. Multiply GDP by wages share, you get wages. That's then giving some income to households. So I can now have households consuming. So households will have a turnover rate as well. How fast do they spend their bank accounts? And that'll be higher for households because they've got less money than firms. We're talking workers, you're living sort of month to month. So you might turn over the amount of money in your account 12 times a year. And that, your bank account might be $1,000, you spend $12,000 over the year. That's a 12-to-1 ratio there. That gives you your consumption. Then I've got bankers charging a fee on interest. I have to have interest payments here, which I haven't included yet. So I want to have spending by the banks, and that's going to be based on a bank fee. So the fee is going to be charged on interest. So I need to have interest payments. Interest payments are going to be based on the amount of debt that firms owe. So I have an interest rate. I'll make that a parameter and say interest rate is 5%. You multiply the debt of firms by the interest rate. That's the amount they pay in interest. And the same thing applies, the same interest rate for bonds. Interest on bonds is going to be the debt of the government times the interest rate. So multiply that. And now the interest, banks make money by charging a fee. So they're going to charge a fee on the amount of money that is paid in interest to the households by firms. So I'm going to have a fee rate here. Let's say that's 20%. So they get 20% of what's been paid as interest to households. That's how they get income. And then bank spending is based on the amount of money in bank accounts. So I'm going to multiply, have a turnover rate for banks, and because they're wealthy, they have a very low turnover rate. Let's say they might turn over 10% of their money every year, but I'll give a room for a bit of a range there to change the value if necessary. So that's turnover by banks becomes spending by banks. And now I need to include borrowing. So I've got borrowing by firms. I'm going to base that on the amount of money currently in firms' bank accounts. So there'll be a borrow rate. And let's say their range might be that they are willing to increase the amount of debt they've got by, say, 20% per annum. And they also might reduce it by the same amount if they're worried about the amount of debt they've accumulated, and give them a step size so they can vary the amount by 1% of GDP. So multiply the borrow rate by the amount in the firm's bank accounts. That then gives you how much they're going to borrow. And then I do a similar thing for the government. So I've got the government spending based on a fraction of GDP. So I've got GDP down here. I then multiply a spend rate and a tax rate by the government. So let's have a spend rate by the government of, say, 30% of GDP, which is roughly the level of government spending. So let's say that's 30% of GDP is government spending, maximum of 50%, minimum of 20%, step size of 1%. So multiply the spend rate by GDP, and I then get government spending. And exactly the same thing for taxation, have a tax rate, and give that the same values as the spend rate. So they spend, say, they tax 30% of GDP, maximum of 50%, minimum of 20, step size of 1%. That's going to give you taxation. And now you get the rules that control what governments are allowed to do. So if government spends more than it gets back in taxation, that's called a deficit. So I model this two together, and spending minus taxation. I don't want the multiply key, I want a minus key there. Spending minus taxation is a deficit. And this is what Musk was freaking out about in that earlier video. That's the deficit. And then if there are outstanding bonds, and that's up here, paying interest on bonds, they've got to add interest on bonds to the deficit, and that's what they sell as new bonds. So we now have, we've got bond sales turning up here. So that's what the government is required to do. Now, having put all that together bloody quickly, and I do apologise for the speed here, but I want to show what happens with this model. So let's just take a look at a couple of elements of the system. Let's look at the amount of money in accounts. So I've got money in household accounts, the government's account, the amount in the firm's accounts, and the bank's equity. Put all that together. That's effectively the money supply. And I've got bank's equity here. Yeah, okay. Okay. And then I've got GDP. Let's take a look at GDP and model that. And now I can simulate this model and see what actually happens with the system. I hope I've defined it completely there. And what I've got is, if I run the model, we get a system where everything stabilizes over time. I've got GDP will ultimately settle down. I hope I've done the mathematics properly there. It should stabilize and stop growing at some point. And if I now, let's have a look at the level of debt. Let's take a look at the debt by firms and the debt by the government sector. So I'm going to look at them as a proportion of GDP. So I divide them both by GDP and see whether we have a rising ratio of debt to GDP or not over time, or whether it stabilizes. So that's working out debt of firms as a percentage of GDP. This is the debt of government as a percentage of GDP. And graph those two here and see if we have anything resembling a crisis coming out of this, which is what the panic you get from Musk is about, an exploding level of government debt. So I'll just quickly simulate the system again to see how it's operating. Flat line level of debt because there's no borrowing going on. If I have the firms start to borrow, you get a rising level of private debt to GDP. And if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, and that's what they're all freaking about, then the government also has a rising level of debt to GDP. But that will actually reach infinite levels over time. You can see it's getting steeper and steeper, much steeper than government debt. Keep this on for long enough, debt's 40% of GDP, 50%, 60, etc., etc. Interest payments would equally become parabolic. You're in for a crisis, and GDP is starting to decline as well. And so what they see happening is government debt reaching a 200% of GDP, 250, 300. It's a chaos. We can't allow this to happen. We've got to cut government spending. That's the mentality that they have. I'll come back to you in a second, Nick, because I'm doing this far too quickly.
We can't see the graph, Steve.
Oh, you can't see the graph? Oh, pardon me. Let's actually fix that up. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, pardon me, it wasn't on screen. So that's showing an exponential increase in government debt. That's 330 times GDP, okay? Obviously a crisis. We're going to have a breakdown. Now, the point that David made brilliantly in Debt the First 5,000 Years and all his work on debt is that, and this is what Michael Hudson and I have taught him this, and he's taught us the same in reverse. Debt creates money. Now, what's going on here, the huge amount of debt, there's no money creation. Okay? The model the economists use leaves out money creation, not just by the bank, by the government, but also by the private sector. And the reason they make a mistake is they have this myth that households lend to firms and households lend to government. And that's the cause of the whole crisis. Now, the paper that came out from the Bank of England, the line that my post-Keynesian school have been making for decades now, is that banks are not intermediaries. Banks create money and create debt at the same time. So I can very rapidly, I'll actually quickly save this as DGI UNI here and come back to this later. I can now say that there's where the crisis comes from, that simulation I showed a moment ago. But I'll quickly just run it again so you can see the crisis in terms of an explosion of the level of debt as a fraction of GDP, government debt, and I'll show government interest payments as well. So this is interest on bonds, and divide that by GDP, and see what happens to that over time. And I'll put it through a percentage operator, so you see it in percentage terms as well. So now we're going to have debt up here and interest payments on debt down here. When you've got a 1% of GDP deficit, the government's spending 1% more than it's taking back in taxation. And if you run the system, I'll just repeat to show what's actually going on. This is the mental model that people who don't understand debt but run government policy because they're economists, this is what they see happening, and they're persuaded, politicians, journalists, most of the public, that we can't allow this to happen unless we get the government back to the stage where it spends no more than it takes in taxation. We're going to have a crisis. Pardon me. The keyboard here is too sensitive. So you can see the level of interest on government interest on outstanding bonds hitting 30% of GDP, 40, 50, 60. This is unsustainable. No way this can actually be allowed to continue happening. And that's what they're all panicking about. But what I can do very rapidly is say, well, that's a false model. What you're modeling is presuming that banks are just intermediaries. So let's go back to the bank table, to the household table here, and say, it's not true that households lend to firms. It's not true that households lend to governments. So let's just delete those operations and say the debt of firms is not an asset of the banking sector. The debt of the government is not an asset of the banking sector. The government doesn't sell bonds to households directly. Firms don't borrow from households. Forget about the fee. Households don't get interest on bonds initially. They don't get tax interest there. They've only got those three operations. They get wages, they consume, and they pay taxes. That's the household sector simplified. Now I come over to the banking table and say, in fact, the debt of government and debt of the firm sector are assets of the banking sector. So we're now rapidly bring that across, and now borrowing by firms increases the debt of the firms, bond sales increase the debt of the government, get rid of this banks fee thing here, and it's not true that the government banks with private banks, so get rid of that. And now I come over and say what the government actually does is it banks at the Fed. So bring up this table and show that as well as the Federal Reserve having a liability of reserves, it also has the government bank account as its liability. And so all these transfers of bonds and everything else, bond revenue reduces reserves, interest on bonds increases reserves, spending by the government increases reserves. Hang on a second. And taxation reduces reserves. That's now correct. Let's balance the equity again and come back to the system. I've now got to just complete the banks table and show that they get paid interest. So banks are the ones that get interest on bonds. Banks are the ones that get interest on from debt of firms. So all I've done is just change the structure. I haven't changed any of the equations. I've still got the government running a 1% of GDP deficit. Let's now just run that model again, just by changing who's supposed to own what, and see what happens to the level of debt and the level of interest payments. And they both rise for a while. You notice the debt of firms is the, which one is the debt of firms there? Okay. Rising, but you will not get a crisis. They're going to level out. I'll stop the debt of firms rising there by reducing their borrow rate. Now, I may have made a stuff up in my model, but notice what's happening. The amount of money is growing. Debt is money. Okay? Debt is the mirror image of money. So as the government is borrowing, it's creating money. Okay? And rather than the debt level going through the roof, which is what happened beforehand, the debt level starts to stabilise. Interest payments stabilise. I'm getting a government debt level with these numbers I rapidly put together of about 75% of GDP, but it stabilises because creating debt creates money, both by the by the banking sector and by the government. You don't have a crisis. The whole idea that there's a crisis here is just understanding a false model of how banks operate. So I know I've done that, hang on a second, far too quickly. I'll save this as DGO2 here. And I'll fix it up for later presentation. But the idea that there's a crisis ahead of us is based on simply having a false idea of how the banking system operates. And this is the crazy thing about the approach that we have been taught by economists. They have models which are false. Okay? And this is what David's point again about what economists do. They don't look at the data. They make up models. They don't really care what's there, and he's quite right. They've got their own vision. They don't want to challenge it by looking at the real world. They have enough evidence to plug in a model where they show signs that people are doing what they think they should be doing. They create a model saying it, and that's what they think is decent research. And David said, I think anthropology is the happy medium. It looks at the real world. It tries to make a model based on the real world. David's vision was correct. The vision that I've created, that Michael Hudson has created, are all correct visions of how the banking system operates. And the crisis that Musk and Reeves and the European Union are all terrified about, a rising government debt, is simply wrong. Okay? So we are being persecuted by idiots. And we need to get the public to know how banks actually operate. And when you do that, all the fears that they have of a runaway crisis from government debt disappear. The thing which David worried about back in the days of the Occupy Wall Street, the financial sector, that's the source of instability. That's the sort of capitalism crises, and that's what we should be focusing upon. David was dead right. The economists are wrong. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry it was such a rushed presentation and so technical, but let's go from there anyway.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, we also Just I know that you're giving these lectures, very detailed lectures in your university, and just very complex stuff, and we're rushing this discussion.
This is my fourth lecture today, so I think I'm overloaded on lectures, unfortunately.
Yeah, we just have this discussion for only an hour, and they are all over the place, as David was, from philosophy to art, to economics, to anthropology, and so on. So we are collecting questions now. Maybe we can have like a 15 minutes question and answers, if Steve is okay with that. And maybe I can start from the question that...
One very interesting question in the chat.
Okay, cool. So then you...
Yeah.
It seems unlikely that we are going to be able to get the governments to ditch these false models and embrace the true model. So what will happen when the neoclassicals follow through on their logic?
Good question. And I agree it's a very good question. What will happen is they'll get disappointing results in economic growth, and they won't be able to get the budget cuts they're trying to achieve. So they'll end up with still running a deficit. So the only solution again is to cut spending. And that'll mean that next year there's less economic growth, a deficit still results, so cut spending again. It's a recipe for a race to the bottom. That's the real dilemma. And within the process, they won't cut warfare, okay, but they will cut welfare. So there'll be spending for war in Ukraine and Israel, all the military bases of the Americans. They'll never challenge that. But they'll cut back on unemployment benefits, they'll cut back on health, they'll cut back on education. We end up running capitalism into the ground. That's the great tragedy. And at the same time, of course, they're going drill, baby, drill. The other thing I haven't covered here, which is my main focus these days, is that economists have completely trivialized the dangers of climate change. So especially with Trump in charge in America and a growth-obsessed government in the UK, which doesn't understand growth, we're going to get accelerated use of carbon-based fuels, accelerated breakdown of the biosphere. So I actually believe that economists, in this sense, because they're the ones who've trivialized the dangers of climate change, they're going to be the ones who cause capitalism to collapse. Not the anarchists, not the communists, not the Marxists. It's the neoclassical economists who are going to kill capitalism.
Leo?
Any other? Yeah.
Hi.
Leopoldo.
Tons of questions. I'm not an economist. And
Lucky you.
Yes, I don't understand anything of this. But it's more of a cultural question that I always wonder, because I have a brother who studied finance and does all that kind of stuff. And this is in general, going back to different models, different approaches, and what actually at the end of the day ends up becoming taught at university level, what ends up producing a particular financial class. How is it possible?
How does it happen?
Sorry?
So you keep going, sorry, yeah.
So how is it possible that alternative models are not as widespread and taught as you would assume?
It's largely because of the point that I made about neoclassical economics being a version of anarchy, the theory of a perfect anarchist society. I remember when I was taught this at school, like high school, a 16, 17-year-old kid, I took it all seriously. I thought the demand and supply curves and equilibrium and all that sort of stuff made perfect sense. And it makes you a zealot for changing the nature of the system to match what the textbook says the system is. So my favorite experience of that ever was when I became a critic, of course. I spent my time trying to undermine conventional economics. And I worked for part of the Australian government, which it was called the Business Union Consultation Unit, otherwise known as BUCU. Okay, so BUCU organised conferences between unions and management, and I've organised one with the food preserving industry, where I had a member of what's called the Industries Assistance Commission, who was at this societal level of tariffs, who was a very rabid neoclassical, and he was attacked by both the workers and the management. He had no idea he was going to be attacked as vigorously as he was. And I actually felt sorry for him after the experience. So we had a drink afterwards, and we're chatting away, having a drink. Nobody else would talk to him in the bar. And he finally said to me, "Look, you're an economist. Help me convert these people." It's religious. It's actually a religious belief. They actually believe they know how to design Valhalla. And they're trying to get us to Valhalla, kicking and screaming over our resistance, let us take over. It's going to be a great system. Because it's a completely fallacious system of the economy, it's actually highly destructive. But because they believe it, they ignore the evidence against it. They ignore failures of the theory. And this is something which is actually common to all academic disciplines. Have you heard of Thomas Kuhn's work on the idea of scientific paradigms? Okay, well, every discipline has a paradigm, including physics, for example. So if you go back to the 19th century, the paradigm was dominated by Maxwell, and the idea energy was continuous. You had waves of energy. And then Max Planck solved what's called the black body radiation problem and showed that energy had to come in discrete units we now call quanta. And he said he completely failed to persuade any of his Maxwellian colleagues to change their minds. They would not change their paradigm. He said what instead happens is new students come along who accept the new paradigm and the old ones die, and that's how science progresses. Now, in economics, for two reasons that doesn't happen. First of all, the crises that occur in capitalism are transient. They're not permanent things like the double slit experiment that you simply can't explain except with quantum mechanics. So the depression has been and gone. Nobody worries about the depression anymore except characters like me. The inflation of the 70s has been and gone. All the crises are transient, so you can forget the failings of the theory. But secondly, it's a seductive vision of a perfect anarchist society. And young people come into it, mainly young men. They get seduced by that vision and they're locked into it. And then when the professor dies, the professor chooses them as their replacement. So you don't get the generational change that characterizes a real science leading to scientific revolutions. So it won't change. I've given up. I've been in the academic sector for 50 years, including my time as a student. And 50 years later, the version of neoclassical economics that exists today is even more rabid than the garbage I was taught in the 1970s. So the only way to get change is outside the university sector. That's why I'm working with NICA to try to establish an institute where we can teach this stuff outside conventional universities. It's why I'm giving online courses on the material. And it's why I think the public has to learn the type of approach I covered very quickly there. I know I did a very bad job. But if that sort of system can be learned, it's like teaching people how to use a telescope back in the days of Galileo. So you can believe the Earth is the center of the universe and everything rotates around us until somebody shoves your eye up against a telescope and shows you the moon's orbiting Jupiter. And then the whole theory disappears. So we need the public to take the lead over here. The universities will never reform themselves.
There's another question in the chat. What do you think of the streamlining of government employees in the US with Doge, what David would have described as bullshit jobs, and its effect on government debt and spending?
Well, there are a lot of bullshit jobs in the government. I worked in the Department of Trade, as I mentioned, way back in the 1980s. And like my little section was we were working gangbusters because we all were political appointees and we were trying to achieve progressive political change in the then Labor government at the time. But the rest of it looked like a bit of a sheltered workshop. That's why I referred to a lot of the other workers. There were some good hard workers in there, some good intelligent people, but a lot of people were fairly lazy in that sense. And I can understand Musk's attitude on that front. But equally, government should do the boring stuff. Government should be making sure roads get built. Government should be making sure that, sewerage systems function, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want exciting people doing boring jobs. So it makes plenty of sense to have people doing what look like mundane work, not necessarily working all that hard compared to, what a venture capitalist would do or somebody founding a internet startup. But they make sure the rest of the damn system works. Your internet startup can't work if the sewage system breaks down in your house. Okay, you're going to be too busy fixing up the toilet to get your startup off the ground. So there's a reason for a division in the type of work that governments do versus the type of work that private corporations do. And the stuff that has a long lead time, things like building sewage systems, building dams, power distribution systems, the length of time between starting a project and getting return is so great that if you have to borrow money from the private banking sector, the interest charges are going to crucify you. You won't do it. The government can create the money. It should do that stuff anyway. It doesn't face the interest rate charges. So there's a very good argument that stuff which has a long period before there's a payback, that's what the government should do. Stuff where there's a fast payback, that's what the private sector should do. We should divide the two up. Now, what he's doing with Doge, by slashing employment as drastically as he's doing, he's doing it quite stupidly. I've heard about 700 meteorologists have been sacked already. Weather stations will no longer be able to report the weather. When the next cyclone season comes through, there won't even be warnings of cyclones, quite potentially. People will then see that wasn't government waste. You were maintaining essential long-lived bits of infrastructure of the economy. So we desperately need those boring jobs. But there's lots of bullshit jobs as well. I see more of those in private firms than I see in the government sector. But yeah, it's a waste of people's lives to be doing that sort of stuff. You do want to reduce it, but you get rid of waste, but don't get rid of the deficit. Okay, that's the most important distinction I can make here. If you wanted to reduce government waste, sure, go ahead and do it. But if you eliminate government spending in excessive taxation, you eliminate creation of fiat money. You end up in Ponzi scheme world where the only source of money is private banks. People borrow to speculate on rising house values as they did back during the subprime. You have a boom and a bust. So getting rid of waste is one thing, but like a lot of waste is also spare resources in case an emergency is necessary. I know that one thing Donald Trump did in the last time he was in charge was sack a whole lot of people involved in pandemic preparation just before the bloody pandemic started. Okay, you want people who are there in case things go wrong. So not just bullshit jobs, sometimes they're jobs which are reserved for emergencies, and emergencies are going to happen. Now, my main thing, I completely agree about the bullshit job things. I saw so much of that in the university sector. I'd want to eliminate those too, but don't eliminate the long-term lived elements of a system which only the government will fund, and don't eliminate the government's capacity to create money. Otherwise, you'll end up crashing the economy.
Shlomo, do you see some more questions, or we already?
There's a very interesting comment by Gerald, which maybe you'd like to comment on, which is comparing neoclassical economists with the high priests and with the church of the medieval period. Do you think the two have anything in common?
I think the church had a better idea of what it was doing, frankly. I mean, you know, I'm more willing to believe in virgin birth than I'm in perfect markets. So it is basically, it's a religious institution. And that's what I realized after spending the number of years that I spent in the academic sector. There's a set of beliefs which are so fundamental to the way they perceive themselves that they will literally make mathematical contradictions to hang on to those beliefs. So, for example, one thing I did in my debunking economics was I showed that the theory of profit maximization was wrong. And I remember when I did the proof, it was quite simple calculus, and I had one of the members of my department rush into my room trying to show that I got it wrong. And he showed me his workings, working from the definition of what's called a derivative. And he actually got the definition of a derivative wrong to hang on to his belief that perfect competition worked. And I was just flabbergasted. But they are so wedded to this vision that if you suddenly say, I'm sorry, Mary wasn't a virgin, you know, you get the same reaction. They don't want to know. Imagine if you're an archaeologist who said, I've found the body of Jesus Christ. Would you like to have a look at it, Mr. Pope? And say, I've got a few guards here who want to have a conversation with you with swords. You know, they don't want to know that God Jesus wasn't God. So it is literally, they are that resistant to anything that challenges their beliefs. I found the same thing with Marxists, I've got to say. I found the same thing to some extent with modern monetary theory and their attitudes to foreign trade. So it's unfortunate, it's a human failing. Once you have a set of beliefs, those beliefs become part of your self-definition, and people are very, very unwilling to change their beliefs. There's a handful of idiots like myself who manage to do that, but most people are rigid with that, and economists are the worst because you can't bring about the generational change that happens in genuine sciences to enable true change to occur. So they're worse than the churches.